What you're about to discover is forbidden to be said in schools. These facts are so shocking, so mysterious, that classes don't dare to mention them. But remember, after hearing these facts, you'll never see history the same way again. Number 16. True history of world wars. World wars are often portrayed in schools in a simplified manner, with a clear narrative of good versus evil. However, the reality is much more complex and disturbing. In World War I, for example, soldiers were often used as cannon fodder by incompetent generals. Millions died in futile battles, such as the Battle of the Somme, where over 1 million men were killed or wounded, gained just a few kilometers of territory. The use of chemical weapons, such as mustard gas, caused indescribable suffering. Soldiers who survived often were left with physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. World War II, although often portrayed as a just war against fascism, also has dark aspects that are rarely discussed in the classroom. The Allies, for example, committed acts that today would be considered war crimes. The bombing of Dresden by the British RAF and US Air Force in 1945 resulted in the death of tens of thousands of civilians and the destruction of a historically significant city with little military value. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States remains a controversial topic. Although often justified as necessary to end the war, many historians argue that Japan was already on the brink of surrender, and that the bombs were more a demonstration of power to the Soviet Union than a military necessity. The Holocaust, although widely recognized as one of the most horrible events in human history, is often presented in a simplified manner. The complacency and collaboration of ordinary citizens, as well as widespread anti-Semitism in many countries beyond Germany, are topics that rarely receive adequate attention. Moreover, other genocides that occurred during World War II, such as the massacre of Chinese by the Japanese army in Nanking, or the Holodomor, the artificial famine imposed by Stalin in Ukraine, received much less attention in school curricula. The role of the Soviet Union in defeating Germany is often minimized in Western narratives, as are the atrocities committed by the Red Army during its march to Berlin. Number 15. The hidden history of human experimentation. Throughout history, governments and medical institutions have conducted unethical experiments on human beings, often targeting vulnerable populations. These experiments, carried out in the name of science and progress, violated basic human rights and caused incalculable suffering. One of the most infamous cases is the Tuskegee syphilis study, conducted in the United States between 1932 and 1972. In this study, hundreds of African American men with syphilis were left untreated, even after penicillin became the standard treatment, so that researchers could study the natural progression of the disease. During World War II, Nazi doctors conducted horrific experiments on concentration camp prisoners. These included hypothermia tests, where victims were forced to remain in ice-cold water or exposed to freezing temperatures, and altitude experiment, where prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers to simulate high altitude. In Japan, the infamous Unit 731 conducted brutal experiments on Chinese and Korean prisoners, including vivisections without anesthesia and biological weapons tests. Even after the war, governments continued to conduct unethical experiments. In the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA conducted Project MK Ultra, a secret mind control program that involved the non-consensual use of psychoactive drugs, such as LSD, on American and Canadian citizens. In the United Kingdom, between the 1950s and 1970s, thousands of children in orphanages were subjected to vaccine tests without the knowledge or consent of their guardians. And speaking of tests, I want you to answer a question for me. Are you already subscribed to our channel? If not, take the opportunity now and subscribe to stay up to date with the greatest curiosities about our world. Well, now that you've done that, let's continue. Number 14. The ice that froze history. In the early 14th century, the Earth entered a period of intense cooling known as the Little Ice Age. This climatic phenomenon, which extended until the mid-19th century, drastically transformed life in Europe and other parts of the world. Temperatures plummeted, causing brutally cold winters and abnormally cool summers. In some regions, the climate became so severe that birds froze in mid-flight, falling from the sky like ice stone. Agricultural fields once fertile became unproductive, leading to widespread food shortages. Consequences were devastating. Famine spread, decimating entire populations. Diseases proliferated amidst malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. Entire communities were forced to migrate in search of more habitable lands. Artists of the time captured the harshness of these times in their work. A particularly impactful painting is Breaking the Ice by English artist George Morland, which depicts a family struggling to obtain water from a frozen lake amidst cutting winds. Scientists believe that multiple factors contributed to this global cooling, including a decrease in solar activity and an increase in volcanic activity. The slowdown of the Gulf Stream may have also played a crucial role. Ironically, today we face the opposite problem: global warming. Just like the Little Ice Age, current climate changes have the potential to drastically reshape our societies and ecosystems. Number 13. The teeth that shaped a nation. George Washington, the first president of the United States and one of the nation's founding fathers, buried a painful secret that few knew in his time. At age 20, he began losing his teeth for unknown reason. When he assumed the presidency in 1789, he had only one lonely tooth left. Conscious of his appearance, Washington turned to Dr. John Greenwood, pioneering dentist of his time. Contrary to the popular belief that his dentures were made of wood, the devices created for the president were actually masterpieces, primitive dentistry. Greenwood fabricated 4 sets of dentures for Washington throughout his life. These were not simple substitutes, but rather ingenious creations made from surprising materials. The artificial teeth were carved from hippopotamus and elephant ivory, and some even from human bones. The structure was supported by a gold plate, demonstrating the level of sophistication achieved at the time. Greenwood was the first dentist to use elephant ivory for dental prosthetics, an innovation that allowed Washington to maintain his dignity in public and articulate his speeches clearly. Today, these historical artifacts are preserved in museums in Baltimore and New York, silent witnesses to the challenges faced by one of the most powerful men of his time. Number 12. The War Against Birds. After World War I, about 5,000 Australian soldiers received lands in the western part of the country as a reward for their services. However, their joy was short-lived. In 1932, these new landowners faced an unexpected enemy, a horde of about 20,000 emu birds. These giant birds, native to Australia, invaded the newly cultivated lands, destroying crops, knocking down fences, and depleting water supply. The situation became so severe that farmers, fearing famine, asked the government for help. In response, Australia's Minister of Defence, George Pearce, made an unprecedented decision to declare war on the birds. This unusual conflict became known as the Great Emu War. The Australian Army, equipped with Lewis machine guns, was sent to combat the bird. However, what seemed to be a simple task soon proved to be a formidable challenge. The emus, with their height of up to 1.80 meters and weight of up to 45 kilos, proved to be surprisingly difficult adversaries. Capable of running at speeds of up to 48 kilometers per hour and always traveling in flocks, the emus often managed to escape military ambushes. The soldiers, accustomed to conventional warfare tactics, were frustrated by the agility and endurance of these birds. After several failed attempts and only moderate success, about 1,000 birds killed in a single battle, the Ministry of Defense was forced to admit defeat. Farmers were left to deal with the problem on their own. Number 11. The Dancing Plague. In 1518, the city of Strasbourg was the scene of one of the most bizarre and inexplicable events in history, the Dancing Plague. It all began when a woman named Frau Troffea left her house and began dancing frenetically in the street. What initially seemed to be an isolated act of eccentricity soon turned into a mass phenomenon. In the following days, more and more people joined the incessant dance. Within a week, more than 1,000 people were involved in this collective frenzy. Participants danced day and night, without stopping to eat or sleep. Many fell from exhaustion, only to get up and continue dancing as soon as they regained some strength. Local authorities, perplexed by the situation, tried various approaches to contain the epidemic. Initially, believing that more dancing could cure those affected, they provided musicians and opened dance hall. When this failed, they resorted to medical methods of the time, such as bloodletting, but nothing seemed to work. As the situation worsened, with people dying from exhaustion, heart attack, and stroke, the authorities took drastic measures. They decided to isolate the dancers, removing them from the city. This action eventually led to the end of the epidemic, but not before causing numerous deaths and leaving an indelible mark on the city's history. The most curious thing is that this was not an isolated event. Similar cases were recorded in France in the 14th century, in Belgium in the 15th century, and even in Madagascar in the 19th century. The exact nature of this dance plague remains a mystery to this day. Theories about the causes vary widely. Some researchers suggest that it could have been the result of mass ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye and can cause hallucinations. Others propose psychological explanations, such as mass hysteria triggered by extreme stress and religious beliefs of the time. Number 10. The dark side of the discoveries. School books often paint European explorers as brave heroes. The reality is much darker. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas in 1492, he didn't just discover a new world. He initiated one of the bloodiest periods in human history. Native Americans were subjected to devastating diseases, slavery, and mass genocide. It's estimated that up to 90% of the indigenous population was decimated in the centuries following the arrival of Europeans. Columbus personally oversaw the massacre and enslavement of thousands of Taino natives in the Caribbean. This is not an isolated fact. Throughout the New World, from Mexico to Peru, entire civilizations were destroyed in the name of gold, glory, and God. Quest for riches led to the destruction of ancient cultures, such as the Aztecs and Incas. Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, used brutal tactics to subjugate entire empires. They exploited internal conflicts, used superior technology, and often resorted to outright treachery to achieve their goals. Number 9. The horrors of indigenous boarding schools. One of the darkest chapters in North American and Canadian history is the system of indigenous boarding schools. For over a century, indigenous children were torn from their families and forced to attend these institutions. The stated goal, killing the Indian and saving the man. In these schools, children were forbidden from speaking their native languages, practicing their traditional religions, or expressing any aspect of their culture. The punishment for disobedience was severe, often including physical and sexual abuse. Conditions in the boarding schools were often inhumane. Many children died from malnutrition, disease, neglect. Recent discoveries of mass graves at former boarding school sites in Canada have shocked the world, revealing the true scale of this tragedy. The trauma inflicted by this system did not end with the closure of the schools. Generations of indigenous people grew up disconnected from their cultures, languages, and traditions, resulting in a lasting legacy of social and psychological problems. This system was not a historical accident, but a deliberate policy of cultural genocide. The goal was to eradicate indigenous cultures and force assimilation into the dominant society. Number 8. The dark origins of famous brands. Many globally recognized brands have origin stories that are carefully hidden from the public. These stories often involve collaboration with oppressive regimes, worker exploitation, or unethical business practice. For example, several famous German companies, such as Volkswagen, Siemens, and Hugo Boss, direct links to the Nazi regime. Volkswagen was founded by the Nazi Party and used slave labor during World War II. Hugo Boss designed and manufactured uniforms for the Nazi armed forces. In the United States, Coca-Cola has a controversial history that is rarely discussed. During World War II, when Coca-Cola syrup couldn't be exported to Nazi Germany due to trade embargoes, the company developed Fanta specifically for the German market, allowing it to continue profiting under the Nazi regime. The history of the United Fruit Company, now Chiquita Brands International, is another disturbing example. The company was accused of exploiting workers in Central America and collaborating with repressive governments to protect its business interests. In 1954, the United Fruit Company played a crucial role in the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala, which overthrew a democratically elected government in favor of a military dictatorship. Nestlé faced severe criticism for its aggressive marketing of infant formula in developing countries, which led to widespread health problems when mothers without access to clean water or means to sterilize bottles used the product. Many modern technology companies also have problematic histories. IBM, for example, was accused of providing technology that helped the Nazis track and exterminate Jews during the Holocaust. Number 7. Truth about slavery in the United States. Slavery in the United States is often presented as a Southern phenomenon, but the truth is much more complex and disturbing. Many schools fail to teach that slavery was a national institution, deeply rooted in the economy and society of the entire country. New York, for example, was a major center of the slave trade for centuries. Wall Street, the financial heart of the world, owes its name to a wall built by African slaves to protect Dutch settlers. Moreover, many of the nation's founding fathers, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were slave owners. Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence that proclaimed all men are created equal, owned over 600 slaves throughout his life. The brutality of slavery is also often softened in textbooks. Cruel punishments, families forcibly separated, systematic rapes of enslaved women. All these horrors are often omitted or minimized. Another little discussed fact is the role of science in justifying racism. In the 19th century, scientists developed pseudoscientific theories to prove the racial inferiority of Africans, providing a rational justification for the continuation of slavery. The struggle against slavery is also often simplified. While figures like Abraham Lincoln are celebrated, crucial role of the slaves themselves in their liberation, the revolts, escapes, and daily resistance, is often neglected. Number 6. The hidden history of colonialism. Colonialism is often presented in schools as an era of exploration and discovery, with emphasis on the technological and cultural advances it brought. However, the reality of colonialism is much darker, and its consequences continue to shape the world today. King Leopold II of Belgium, for example, turned Congo into his personal property in the late 19th century. Under his rule, millions of Congolese were brutally exploited and murdered in the pursuit of rubber. It's estimated that half of Congo's population died during this period. In India, British rule resulted in devastating famine. Great Bengal famine of 1943, for instance, killed millions of people, while the British government continued to export food from the region. In Latin America, Spanish and Portuguese colonizers not only decimated indigenous populations through disease and violence, but also implemented brutal systems of forced labor, such as the mita and encomienda, persisted for centuries. In Africa, the transatlantic slave trade devastated entire societies and permanently altered the continent's demographic. Even after the official end of slavery, colonial powers continued to exploit African resources through systems like forced labor and apartheid. The legacy of colonialism persists to this day in the form of artificial borders, ethnic conflicts, and global economic inequalities. Many of the problems faced by developing countries have their direct roots in colonial policies. Moreover, the cultural looting carried out by colonial powers is rarely addressed in detail. European and North American museums are full of artifacts stolen during the colonial era, and many countries remain reluctant to return them. Number 5. The controversial origins of religions and cults. The origins and history of the world's major religions are often presented superficially and uncritically in schools, avoiding controversial and potentially disturbing aspects. For example, few schools address the historical evidence that contradicts traditional religious narratives. The lack of archaeological evidence for biblical events such as the Exodus or the reign of David and Solomon is rarely discussed. The role of religions in justifying wars, persecutions, and oppression is also often minimized. Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, European religious wars, and the role of religion in colonization are topics that rarely receive in-depth treatment. The history of the Vatican includes dark chapters, such as the persecution of scientists like Galileo, support for fascist regimes in the 20th century, and the systematic cover-up of cases of sexual abuse by the clergy. In the case of Islam, the complexity of its history and different interpretations of its sacred texts are often simplified, leading to stereotypes and misunderstanding. The emergence of new religious movements and cults in the 20th century is also a topic rarely addressed in depth. Events such as the Jonestown mass suicide or the sarin gas attacks by the Aum Shinrikyo cult in Japan raise uncomfortable questions about the nature of faith and psychological manipulation. These topics are avoided in schools because they are considered sensitive and potentially offensive. However, a critical understanding of religious history is crucial for navigating today's diverse and often conflicted world. Number 4. The hidden history of the Cold War. The Cold War is generally presented as an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, with the United States as the good guys and the Soviet Union as the villains. However, the reality is much more complex and morally ambiguous. Both sides committed atrocities and human rights violations in the name of fighting the other. The US, for example, supported numerous coups and brutal dictatorships in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, as long as these regimes were anti-communist. The CIA was involved in overthrowing democratically elected governments, such as in Iran in 1953 and Chile in 1973. These actions had lasting consequences that continue to affect global politics to this day. On the other hand, the Soviet Union imposed oppressive regimes throughout Eastern Europe and brutally repressed attempts at reform, such as in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Both superpowers engaged in dangerous arms races, accumulating nuclear arsenals capable of destroying the world several times over. There were several moments when the world was on the brink of nuclear war, such as during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Cold War also saw the rise of mass surveillance programs, both in the US and USSR, which undermined civil liberties and created a climate of fear and paranoia. Number 3. The secrets of the space race. The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union is usually presented as a noble competition of scientific advancement. However, there are darker aspects to this history that are rarely discussed in schools. Both sides employed Nazi scientists after World War II to boost their space program. Wernher von Braun, the architect of NASA's rocket program, was previously a Nazi party member who used slave labor to build V-2 missiles. I'll continue translating the text from Portuguese to English. The space race was closely linked to the development of military technology, including intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads. There were numerous accidents and deaths on both sides that were covered up at the time. The Netherlands disaster in the Soviet Union, for example, killed about 100 people when a missile exploded on the launch pad. The health risks to astronauts and cosmonauts were often minimized or ignored. Many suffered long-term effects from radiation exposure and microgravity. The fierce competition led to hasty and potentially dangerous decisions, as exemplified by the Apollo 1 tragedy, where 3 astronauts died in a fire during a ground test. The enormous cost of space programs at a time when many citizens were living in poverty raises ethical questions that are rarely discussed. Number 2. The true history of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is often portrayed in schools as a period of progress and innovation that drastically improved quality of life. However, this narrative ignores the enormous human and environmental costs of this process. Working conditions in the early factories were often brutal. Children as young as 5 were forced to work long hours in dangerous conditions. Accidents, respiratory diseases, and deformities caused by repetitive work were common. Industrial cities grew rapidly without adequate planning, leading to terrible living conditions for the working class. Overcrowded slums without proper sanitation were breeding grounds for diseases such as cholera and tuberculosis. Pollution caused by factories poisoned rivers, contaminated the air, and created health problems that persist to this day in many industrial areas. The Industrial Revolution also saw the emergence of new forms of colonial exploitation, as European powers sought raw materials and new markets for their industrialized product. The displacement of skilled workers by machines led to resistance movements, such as the Luddites, which were brutally repressed. Number 1. The hidden history of medicine. The history of medicine is usually presented as a steady march of progress, with heroic doctors and scientists overcoming ignorance and superstition. However, there are darker chapters in this history that are rarely discussed in schools. Throughout history, medicine has often been used as a tool of oppression. In the 19th century, for example, drapetomania was considered a mental illness that made slaves want to escape. This was used to justify brutality against slaves. Eugenics, a pseudoscience that sought to improve the human race through selective breeding, was widely accepted in the early 20th century. This led to forced sterilization programs in many countries, including the United States, where tens of thousands of people considered unfit were sterilized against their will. The pharmaceutical industry has a history of unethical practices, including drug testing on vulnerable populations without adequate consent. Case of thalidomide, where a morning sickness drug caused birth defects in thousands of babies, is a disturbing example. The history of psychiatry includes dark chapters, such as the widespread use of lobotomies and electroconvulsive shock therapy without adequate consent. Do you see this video that's appearing on the screen now? Click on it now because I've set it aside especially for you. Well, that's it, and until next time, Curious One.